Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Live, and you're watching Testcontainers Live. It's a beautiful day here in Estonia, and I'm very, very happy to introduce our today's topic and our today's guest, Austin Dase from Fundrise. Hi, Austin. How are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very excited about our today session because this will be a little bit different from what we did in the past. I think it would be very, very interesting. Uh, I have a number of questions about you and about Fundrise and your approach to tests, how you do testing, of course, how you use test containers and your experience with that. And I think it's going to be great to just talk through this in a very casual but informative way, sort of as one would do at a conference in the hallway track, being like, "Oh, Austin, there! I'm going to go ask him a question." So that's what we're going to do today. I think it's going to be short and sweet and informative. So if you have any questions and you're watching us live, please ask them in the YouTube chat. If you're watching a recording, please reach out on social media. We're going to be very, very happy to have the conversation and talk to you. So without further ado, Austin, can you please introduce yourself and, well, not introduce yourself, describe what you're doing at Fundrise in a couple of words, and maybe in general, what is Fundrise?
Sure, yeah. And I should start off. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I think it's going to be, some interesting things to talk about, and some things that I'm excited to talk about. So, thanks for having me on. So I think the best thing to start with is maybe background on Fundrise a little bit. So Fundrise is an investment management platform for alternative investments, and focused on like democratizing private market investments for the individual, and been around for since 2012. And the majority of our history was focused on real estate. In the last year or so, we started to apply some of the same frameworks to the venture capital and tech space. And that in the real estate industry that we've been focused on, and the venture space that we've been focused on, not a lot of disruption in those industries over the last couple, over their existence, I suppose. Versus like some other industries, you've seen like a lot of disruption, and like the key to that disruption is technology. And so that's kind of where Fundrise comes in, applying technology solutions at like every layer of the business, to both of those industries, and generally to like private market investments in general. So Fundrise, very tech focused. It's kind of at the core of what we are and what we do. So that's been my opportunities here at Fundrise for the last 4 or so years. I've been here working on some of that technology. So I've had the opportunity to work on like a wide variety of things. My personal background is in the Java Spring ecosystem, so you'll hear me talking about a lot of those kinds of things. And it's kind of your day to day like REST APIs, a little GraphQL. Like we worked with AI a little bit also. I won't talk too much about that. Scheduling, applications, those kinds of things, kind of the bread and butter of what I've worked with. And then, most recently, like I talked about, our kind of expansion into the venture space. I had the opportunity, about 2 years ago now, to lead a team that's kind of heading up some of the software that we're building to support that kind of expansion into the venture capital space. So that's kind of the background that I've spent. So my most recent project, and the most recent thing that I've been working on is that kind of suite of software. And it's pretty fun because it's a brand new project, and you can always use new and interesting things that you've had your eye on for a while. So that's kind of what I've been working on for the last couple of years.
Nice, very, very cool. Quick question. You don't have to answer personal. Did you manage to get rich through? Just kidding, just kidding. We don't need to know
I think
that.
this is also where I should probably say no, not investment advice. That's always a good thing to say.
Yes. How the professionals always do that. This is not a financial advice. Please consult the professionals if you want to make decisions based on this. We have some comments. Sergey's in the chat. Hey, Sergey, nice to have you here. Right. So the technology is at the core of the Fundrise business, as you said. Can you like, so what your teams are working on, the can you describe a little bit the applications? Are those like the like amazingly large fleets of microservices? What's the general stack look like? And
Sure.
uh,
So the team I'm working with right now is generally a full stack team. But what I'll kind of focus on is the kind of like API layer and down the stack, I suppose, if you want to call it that. And so, what it looks like in terms of what we're building is basically a modular monolith structure, maybe a couple of services here and there. But like really kind of the key is this modular monolith that supports like a standard API, a GraphQL API, and there's a couple of other things baked in there. There's like a processing application as well for like scheduled tasks and whatnot. But that's the core of it.
right, excellent. And of course, well, like this is no big surprise since you are here at the Test Containers show. You are using test containers. Can you give us a couple of examples? Which technologies do you use test containers with? Which maybe modules you are running?
Sure. So yeah, it's Maven, Java, Spring Boot is kind of like the key pieces to know there. And it's like, we're on 3.1, I think it is now. So some of the latest features available. But when we started the project a while ago, I was looking on a Reddit thread, and it was, I think, on like R Java or something like that. And the question that was asked on that thread was like, what's your favorite like library that you use? And I was looking through and I saw like a good majority, I don't know, maybe it's hindsight, but a good majority to me felt like people were saying test containers. And so I thought to myself, like, I should check out test containers. And so I played around with it. It seemed pretty cool. The idea like immediately kind of resonated with me in terms of some of the things that I had been seeing like in my previous experiences. Working with tests, I'm pretty fond of tests as well, like if you can't tell. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then at the same time, like being able to start this new project, it was great. I can bring in test containers right from the start. Spring Boot has like built in some first class support for test containers, and that's been really handy. And so being able to kind of like start the project with that setup in mind right from the beginning made things like nice and easy, and also you have the opportunity to try like some of the newest things. So I think the thing to like think about is there's a few modules like I was talking about, all like Spring Boot applications essentially. And then there's like some shared libraries between the two of them, and it's like Maven build, I suppose, is another kind of key piece of it. And then in those modules, we have a variety of tests. And like the tests that are really the like test containers that are really important for that we use test containers with are those like integration tests or functional tests. I guess I should probably I'll have to give definitions of the terminologies I'm going to use, because everyone kind of like has a little bit of their own terminology. So I'll define an integration test as something that's like testing functionality between two pieces of your system, or maybe the whole system itself, right? So you have like I want to test I want to test Spring Data JPA like repository that I have, and I have like some custom SQL that I've written, a query that I've written. I want to like stand up my database, and I want to execute that SQL. That's a good integration to make sure things are working. And I'll talk about functional tests as more of like, I want to start my whole application up, and I want to call like REST endpoint X, and I want that endpoint to write some data to the database, and I want to call another endpoint like Y, and I want to get back the data that I wrote when I called X.
Right.
So those will be my definitions that I'll use here.
Right. And you set up the environments for both using test containers, right? So like from the implementation point of view, it's just sort of the entry into the test, and verifying assumptions are on different levels in the business logic.
Exactly right. You might have like slice tests, right? Like web MVC kind of tests, and maybe those don't need test containers for those ones in particular, but you might have a slice test of like your data layer that you do use test containers for.
Do you do lots of unit tests, like purely sort of individual components without the environment set up?
Yeah, definitely. So I think like my general philosophy with unit tests is they're really valuable for things like I don't know, to give a very, very simple example, say I have a class and it has a method in there that wants to determine if the input is even or odd, right? It's like, the most basic function that you can think of. That's a really good thing for a unit test because you have a very like wide variety of inputs that go in and like a very wide range of things that could be sent in there that you need to handle. And so you want to just unit test that one piece of functionality to make sure like one that it works, right? So you're going to test like a couple of even numbers and a couple of odd numbers and make sure that like it returns the right value. But you also want to test like towards the edges also is the way that I refer to it. So like maybe you want to test integer max or integer min, make sure that works, or integer max plus one, something along those lines. You want to make sure 0 works, or if you're not allowing negative numbers, like you want to handle those kinds of things. So I think unit tests are really great in those kinds of situations when you're doing like calculations, that kind of stuff, or if you have a lot of branching logic in a very like simple class. There's still a ton of value to unit tests. I think like to get ahead of myself a little bit, I do think that there's like what I refer to in terms of integration or functional tests is their leverage, and I think they're like just extremely valuable for making sure that the application that you're doing not only like meets the specification that you wanted it to meet, but also you're not introducing any regressions along the line. So I'm going into a little bit more into the integration test, but to answer your question, unit tests like have a great place too.
Right. This is a question that I always wanted to ask the whole world, right? So there are different types of tests, and they send you a signal, right? If you would run your unit tests and they fail, obviously something is wrong, right? Unless they are just broken for no reason. How confident would you be in your application, like functionality, if you just run the unit tests?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think about that sometimes too, and you bring up a good point. Like, sometimes they just fail and they're disabled and whatnot. But like putting that aside, let's say you have only unit tests in your application, you run them and they pass. I would be inclined to say that I don't have as much confidence that the actual application is going to work, in the way that you intended it to work, because that's not what you're testing, right? You're just testing to make sure that like this class like does some things, but how does this class or does this component interact with another component? You're not really checking on that. And when it comes to unit tests, I mean, a lot of times you're going to have to mock dependencies or something along those lines, and maybe you just didn't think of something that the other dependency is going to have when you work with it.
Right.
I could maybe argue the other way a little bit too, but I think like in practice, that's the way that it ends up.
No, there's an opinion, and for the range, some applications and some projects like unit tests would have the higher confidence. Well, if you're working on a library, for example, or like you are contained to the business logic. But it is a very common sentiment that the greenness of your unit tests do not very often give a lot of confidence for like automatic push to production and so on.
What I will say is on a day-to-day basis, I get the most personal comfort out of knowing that our integration tests are passing and working correctly. That makes me feel good when things move up the pipeline.
Like you're making progress. Right.
It makes me feel like I didn't make too many mistakes.
When you use tests, like when you write tests, do you use them for protecting the code from regressions, or do you use also for driving design? What's your philosophy, or maybe the general like Fundrise philosophy about testing? How do you use that?
Yeah, I think both for sure. Tests are great to make sure that you've met the specification that you want to meet, because actually, like maybe a good example is you have two developers that are working on something. And one person implements it, the other person tests it, and they need to communicate one way or another, like how you should test it. The most exact way that you can communicate like how you should test it is by writing the tests, and then you have code that communicates that, versus trying to like communicate it over a written document. English is not as exact as code, or whatever language you're using is not as exact as code. So I think that like that's very valuable. Just making sure that I have an automated way to check the thing that I'm doing is working the way that I expected it to do. That's great. And then I think of integration tests as like a fixed cost. So you put in the effort one time to set up something that works well, and then you have this like benefit that goes on and on and on. After that, you put in that one effort, and that's the like protecting you from regressions, and that's where I get like a lot of like I feel better as we go ahead and implement new features in our project, that we didn't break something else that we weren't thinking about when we implemented these new features. That's like, I think there's so much value there. And so definitely the answer is both. The like if you have good tests that ensure you're not like introducing regressions, you can't say enough about that.
Yeah, I agree. I recently read this paper from Microsoft about the developer productivity and how they measure. And well, I might be biased, but to me, like all the like pillars of productivity, like cognitive resources that you need to do changes and like being in the zone, for me the answer was very clear. Like you need to have more and better tests, and then the stuff is better, and then your developer velocity um, is way higher. You mentioned the cost of adding tests. Um, how do you uh, how do you think about that? And like, do you have any other trade-offs? Some people, for example, I know, are reluctant to do more integration or end-to-end higher level functional tests because of the time for executing the pipelines. What's your take on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, in anything that you're doing, there's trade-offs. And so, when you think about writing tests, there's trade-offs. There's a trade-off with not writing tests, that I'd argue is maybe like short-term benefit for long-term pain. But the other like benefit between or sorry, the trade-off between integration tests and unit tests is really just kind of like robustness and speed. So that may mean a couple of different things. Robustness, I'll say, is like maybe the amount of logic that you've covered, and then also like how close to a production environment that you're in terms of robustness, when you're testing, or a real world environment. And then speed is like execution speed and also development speed. So there's execution in terms of like how fast the tests execute, but there's also the time it takes to like write the tests and maintain them as well. And I think that there definitely are trade-offs in both categories. So to and that's kind of where test containers does come into play in certain situations. The integration tests like can be slower to run because you need to stand up dependencies. You maybe need to start up an application context, those kinds of things. You don't need to do that with unit tests. And they also like can be slower to execute slower to execute for that reason. And they also can be a little bit slower to maintain. I don't know, maybe you could argue both ways on that one. But I do think that there are potential trade-offs, and that what we should do is try to mitigate those trade-offs and make sure that like the marginal cost of adding that next test is as low as possible. And I think that's kind of where test containers has come into play for us, is trying to like mitigate some of those trade-offs and make it easier for us to do integration tests, so that like our pipe and Testcontainers Cloud also, so that our pipelines are not taking a long time. The next test that we add is not going to add 30 seconds to the pipeline, those kinds of things. So we're still getting all the benefits that we get out you get out of integration tests and functional tests, without maybe some of those other like complexities that come with adding a new one.
Right. That is very interesting, especially since like I understand that you might have chosen 30 seconds as just a random number, but how long would you say, or maybe if you can disclose that information, the average like pipeline run time for like an average project of yours? And also, what I would love to know is how long do you think is unacceptable, right? Like when it becomes too slow.
Wow, that's a tricky question. Because I think it's going to vary so much on a case by case basis. I think like when is it too slow? That's partially up to like your team to decide, right? Like what works for you.
Yeah.
The things I'll say about like how why you want it to be fast, especially in the pipeline, is it's basically a combination of developer experience and also being able to like do continuous integration, continuous delivery, in the right ways. There's so many things, like you don't want to have to be waiting for builds to run for a really long time before you can, you need to get this like production fix in, right? So the faster you can make your pipelines, you can still make sure you didn't introduce any regressions or cause any problems, but you can also, get quick fixes out as needed. And so you don't want your pipeline to be like this long thing that makes you wait, hours or whatnot, every time you want to make one of those changes. And then at the same time, from like just a developer experience perspective, like you as the developer don't want to initiate a pipeline and then have to like come back 45 minutes later and then find out something
Is broken.
something broke like along the way, and then try again and whatnot. So to like shorten that iteration time in terms of development is developer experience, but also efficiency, right? You're just not wasting as much time either. You don't have to like balance a couple of things in your head. You can get that like faster feedback. I think in a lot of things in terms of software, the faster feedback loops are really, really, really valuable. So to not directly answer your question about like specific times and whatnot, I know I'm throwing out a lot of
It's okay. I heard you. 45 minutes is fairly slow. I hear you. Which is funny that you mentioned now like a number under an hour. Very often, like I when I talk to people who are not very experienced with test containers, when it's a new approach for them, I ask them how do they test locally, and they look at me like, what do you mean test locally? I send my code to CI and I get my answer if I did the thing or not tomorrow.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I really do think like for whatever you're working on, if you can do it, and everyone has a case by case basis, like you should be able to test everything locally, right? You should be able to before you maybe push or something along those lines, to execute most, if not all, of your tests, in your project. And when you start to get to the point where you're not feeling that, like maybe that's something to look at and see, like, is there some things that I can do here? So yeah, for sure.
Thank you. So there is a question from Simon in the chat as, do you do mutation testing?
Can you define mutation testing for me?
Well, so I think this is the approach where you would run and programmatically, automatically change the code of your application, like introduce changes to that automatically. For example, swap like binary operations, or like not call a certain small method, and then you run your tests, and if they fail, that's good, right? They catch the difference in behavior in the application, and if they don't fail, that means that there are gaps in your test suite, which is one of the approaches. And I have not a lot of experience with that, but I think that is what Simon is saying, because he's mentioning PyTest in the chat there.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, the short answer is no, but that same kind of, framework or philosophy applies. Like, testing the negative cases is important, right? So if you're testing an API or something along those lines, making, or you want to test the security, right? So
yeah,
something along those lines, but like making sure that, for an invalid response, I'm getting like, or an invalid request, I'm getting the right, appropriate response, the server's handling it that way. And then as you test the components too, right, you want to make sure you test the things that are not going to work as well, and make sure that the application handles it. And I think that's like probably what you're talking about. It gets back to the same kind of philosophy that like, unexpected states are handled, correctly as well.
Right. I think it's a slightly different case, but since you're mentioning that you are not explicit in mutation testing, I think that answers the Simon's question. For me, along the same lines, do you closely track do you track code coverage, and how much value do you put on those numbers?
Sure. Yeah, we do. And pragmatic value, I suppose. I think it's useful as kind of a tool for the individual. So I'm, working on something, and it's nice for me to run, and really kind of the unit tests specifically on this, but it's nice for integration tests as well. But it's nice to run something and just make sure that I've covered all of the branches.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a nice feedback for me. But, I think is a lot of people, that are listening to this or will watch this, will immediately say like there's a lot of places where code coverage doesn't quite cut it, in terms of like the way, like, did you hit all the branches of logic or whatnot? Did you pass all the possible permutations of the inputs? You're not going to see some things like that with code coverage. So it can't be the end all be all. And I don't think it's good to look at it as just a pure metric and not look at, everything else around that at the same time. So it's like a useful tool in the tool belt, right? Especially as the developer, but I don't give it, if I have 100% code coverage, I don't necessarily think that means, what I'm testing is 100% tested.
Yeah, I think if you have 100% code coverage, you probably have some errors in reporting, or you had too much free time on that. No, it's definitely a tool to make like sort of pragmatic decisions based on. And I love how you put it, that it's sort of a more developer tool rather than like a team-based project tool where you have to ensure specific numbers and stuff like that. I think this is a very practical choice.
Definitely.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about integration tests and your setup and how you use test containers. Do you remember what did you do before test containers?
Sure. So let me just talk, maybe the easiest thing to talk about example wise would be like you have a Spring Boot application and it has, a backing data source like MySQL or something along those lines. So, you want to test that application and you want to, let's just say you want to start up the whole application context and you want to, execute, some requests to the REST API. It's going to write some data to the database. So you have a couple of options to do that. I mean, if you're working with your data source, you need it to exist like when the application context starts up. And so, what do? You can run locally MySQL, right? And you can set up your configurations to connect to that. You could have like maybe a shared remote MySQL if you really wanted to, or you could mock it, I suppose, or do some sort of substitution, or you could use test containers also. So ignoring test containers, those other options, like I think there's a variety of difficulties that, again, like people listening here have probably ran into over the course of their careers. I mean, if you have a shared resource, like you're going to be fighting with everybody else on your team also. So that's out. And then, locally running, a MySQL instance, I think that there's like kind of this move towards a lot of repositories and a lot of work that you can just basically check out the repository, build it and run it right away.
Oh no. Our life? Is this me or is this Austin?
Oh.
I'm sorry. I think one of us froze.
No
And
problem.
I think you're back.
I'm back. Excellent. All right.
Right.
So go ahead.
Yeah. You were talking about. I missed. I missed the point. Like, but you were talking about different approaches, and
Sure.
then
So
how.
onto the MySQL database, right?
Yeah.
So you can you can have one running locally, but you don't really want to have to set up your local environment configurations to do that. Like all kinds of problems. You get to the it works on my machine kind of thing that everyone's heard about before.
Yeah.
And then you also could mock it out. That's probably not really valid, in terms of testing, because you want to test that the integration between the services work. Or you could substitute it out. So I've seen, maybe you're using, instead of MySQL, you use H2 in memory. And that generally works, but I would make the argument that your tests are at least a little less valid than they were before, because you're not using the same real service that you're going to be deploying the application and connecting to. Maybe there's some syntax differences or some slight difference between the database engines when you switch them out, that you're not going to have, and configuration and whatnot, all kinds of things that you're not going to have, that you're not working with a real dependency essentially.
Yeah. There are, like with substitutions, there are, unless there is someone who actually does compatibility verification for you, it's both ways. Like you will have things which fail locally and work in production, which is bad because you cannot actually test that functionality. And then you will have even worse things, which, well, work locally and fail in production, which is like defeats the whole purpose of tests.
Exactly.
But a database like that maybe is a little bit a simpler case. Do you use any cloud technologies or?
Sure. Yeah. The thing I'm excited about using is local stack.
Oh,
So AWS resources. I think local stack is also a great library, and I think there's an official local stack image now too. And so being able to run local stack, I think is pretty is great to run as another resource. A lot of times, when people are mocking things and mocking resources that their application is connecting to, like those cloud service resources are one of the first ones that people actually go ahead and just like, I can't do anything about this, so I'm going to mock it. So being able to start up, something that emulates that is really, really valuable, I think. There's other things too, you might have like Redis, which I could go through local stack also, or you may have just other services that you're connecting to as well. But that, local stack, I'm excited about.
yeah, yeah. No, it's specifically very hard with the cloud technologies because it's very hard to mock. You will need to you usually use them through SDKs, and then when people start mocking their access to the cloud, they need to go like 7 layers classes deep to mock, and then that becomes just the copy of their production code because like they need to repeat all the steps to mock them, and then very often that just drops the value of tests into nothing. And there is an official module, official test containers module for local stack. So if you mentioned that you're not sure if there's that, and the local stack, yeah, as far as I know, the company behind it verifies their compatibility with AWS quite extensively. So which is very, very good. There is a question in chat. We're gonna get to that point a little bit later, but you mentioned local tests. Do you still count as local tests if you run your tests with Testcontainers Cloud?
Yes. So if you're talking about, there's like basically two ways you can use Testcontainers Cloud. You can run that service locally, on your machine, or you can run that service on the machine that's executing when you run like your CI pipeline.
Yeah.
And so to refer to the first one, yes, I do consider that local testing. You're still pointing to those same essentially Docker images that your integration tests are going to be referencing. It's just where those Docker images are hosted. You just aren't spending the resources on your machine to run Docker desktop and to execute those containers. They're just being set up for you by running Testcontainers Cloud agent and connecting to those via Testcontainers Cloud.
I agree. If it quacks like a duck and looks like a duck, it's and if it runs like a local test, then you probably should consider that as a local test. Thank you for the question, Simon, though. Good one. Right. And then, so you do tests. You mentioned that you were using Spring Boot and you actually Spring Boot 3.1. Have you tried the local development environment setup with test containers?
I'm excited about this. I have not, but I am excited about it. The two things, service connection, and then also the local development environment setup, I think is, pretty cool. The local development environment setup, I mean, that's great. So all the things I was just talking about in terms of tests, like not wanting to configure your environment, being able to check out a repository and just build and run. A lot of times that's not the case for you. Even when you just want to run the applications locally, you have to do some sort of local configuration of services, right? I want to run like Redis locally, or I want to run MySQL locally, or something along those lines. So being able to define that configuration via like your native code, that's always great. And also just having it all be in there, self-documented, I think really, really exciting. So I haven't had the chance to do it yet. I've done maybe like one or two quick tests, but I wouldn't say I'm all the way there. But I am pretty excited about that. I think it's great. It makes it like much easier for people to onboard onto a project, for someone who has not run something before to execute it and not have to worry about everything else around the hood. So I think it's really, really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I'm very, very happy that we managed to figure out the integration with the Spring team. to bring that feature where you can use the same configuration with test containers that you use for tests for your local development setup to enable exactly the clone and run situations. And in just since you're going to experiment with that, I went personally a little bit further in my attempts to make that even better. And what, as a random idea for the viewers and for you, you can also run some of the tooling for your dependencies via test containers. For example, if you're running like a Kafka or local stack image, then you can also run maybe some tooling that connects to that and gives you like a console to check what messages are there for Kafka and so on.
Building
Which,
block.
yeah, like a building block, which could be very, very cool to figure out. It's way more project specific than sort of the general integration between test containers and Spring. But if you are interested in doing that, I think you can get very, very cool results, and the whole team will be much more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, the general concept of just being able to run something and to not have to worry about the dependencies, but also
Yeah.
still using the real dependencies, like that's applicable everywhere, in terms of the places that you're, integration tests and also running the application itself.
Right. Very, very nice. You mentioned that well, you were running tests and you were using Testcontainers Cloud. Um, can you share some thoughts about like what drove you there? What benefits do you see?
Sure. Yeah, there's, we were talking earlier about pipeline execution times, and I think that was the thing that stood out to me. So the one thing that Test Containers Cloud did for us is enabled parallel execution of tests. So you can do this in a couple of ways. You can run multi-module project Maven. You can execute those modules in parallel, or you can execute the tests within your modules in parallel. And to get ahead of myself, like it basically depends on your project structure, like what is the most effective or appropriate way to do it for you. But that was the kind of drive to look at Test Containers Cloud, so that again, like that marginal cost of the next test is less. So if I run, let's just say I run my modules in parallel, I have like 5 modules. Each one of them runs for, let's say 4 of them run for a minute and 1 of them runs for 2 minutes. Well, if I can run them all in parallel, it's only going to take 2 minutes, right? Yeah. And I can add a test to one of the other modules that adds 30 seconds, and it's not going to cause any problems for my pipeline. And like that's a big advantage. So that was the big one, I think, for us. And then there's all the things in terms of like that you get from developer experience. I just saw the dashboard, right? You can see, you have a little bit more visibility into how your tests are executing. So I'm excited for some of the stuff that Atomic Jar is like, building on top of that like baseline framework. But that was the thing that kind of drove us to looking at Test Containers Cloud for sure.
Right. Did you how was the switch to this?
So the initial switch, simple. All you do is run the agent, and everything else is taken care of for you. So I think I've seen a couple of people talk about this. It is really one of those kind of drop in, replace things. And if I want to run Docker desktop, I just disable the agent and it goes back, like no code changes needed. So that's really, really handy. And then there's always trade-offs. So when you're getting some positives, you have to deal with some trade-offs of that decision. So the biggest trade-off for us was like the network IO. And so we worked with some of the like Atomic Jar team a little bit to like kind of, find places that we could kind of mitigate those trade-offs. And we did a lot of like pretty interesting things. I think, actually starting up a database and executing, like initializing the schema. Well, actually, I should back up. The things to do, like the things to look at in terms of mitigating network IO issues are to just reduce general network IO. So like the application startup time, you want to reduce like anything that's like needs to be like done to your dependencies. You don't want to make too many round trips to the dependencies. And then during tests, like setup and teardown time, the same thing applies. So maybe like a good one to talk about, is that like kind of, initializing the schema. If a lot of people are probably using something like Liquibase or Flyaway as like a schema migration tool. And if you're using the like MySQL image, the like official MySQL image, That's going to start up the container. And if you are using the Spring Boot integration with, let's say, Liquibase, that's going to execute your change, all of your changes, all of your schema migrations against that database. But it's going to do, I think, each one in a transaction, and that kind of like round trips to the database essentially. So one thing we were like, okay, we can optimize that. So instead of doing that, actually there's some really cool things that I think like that Liquibase plus test containers setup that I think is really valuable in terms of like finding problems with schema migrations earlier on, shifting left, those finding problems. But generally what we wanted to like keep that, but also we want to start up this container as fast as possible. So we found that it was, and I think there's some documentation on the Testcontainers or Atomic Jar website about like different ways that you can do this. But for us, what was good is you can just do an export of your schema in a SQL file, as it is now, and you can copy that over to the container at startup time in the like init directory, so that when the MySQL instance comes up, it just creates the schema from that SQL file that you've created, and that's all done locally. And there's no network I/O on that one, so it's much faster than executing all of your migrations. And then you can have any deltas, like your new migrations, still executed by Liquibase and catch any issues that you've introduced in the current thing that you're working on. But you can just ignore that. So that was like one thing that we did. Reuse is another really important one that I can go on a long tangent if you want. But I think like that's another one that's been huge for us to kind of mitigate those issues. And then also just like during the cleanup times too, like if you need to like maybe clear out all the data in between tests, actually I found like writing a stored procedure to do that on the database and executing that was faster than like, let's say, looping through all of your JPA repositories and executing like a command.
Yes, this is a little bit like with the production code where you don't want to like manage your individual database and entities like one by one, like, and delete them in a loop, because that will take forever. No, those are all very good tricks, and specifically for Liquibase and initializing the schema, there are a number of approaches that I've heard people use. One of them is what you described, where you would create sort of the predefined state, so the Liquibase doesn't go through all the transactions. And then sometimes, I'm not sure if MySQL supports that, but there are features like, I think for Postgres, that's called template databases, where you can create it once and then switch it, and then your next test case or something can get a fresh sort of schema from the template, and that's allegedly very fast. So that if you were watching us now and then you're struggling with that, that could be sort of a direction where you can look at, or indeed like just building your custom images with your pre-baked data. That would also solve the thing. I want to show you one thing, because you mentioned switching to the local Docker environment briefly, and we recently released a new version of. So we renamed our local application to Testcontainers Desktop. I'm not sure if you checked that out yet, but it's available on the website. But it's also, there are a number of features. So it's not just the proxy to the cloud environment for Docker, but it's a tool that we would like to add developer-oriented features to increase their productivity. So for example, now you can run containers locally through the same sort of system, and you can just pick whichever runtime you want from running locally, or in a single click say like, oh, I would like to go to the cloud for switching. So that is a nice thing. And some other things, like for example, you mentioned reusable containers. Now, if you have the API in place, right, you can trigger enabling or disabling reusability with a single click in the same thing, and some other cool features like freezing the containers for debugging, or configuring the fixed ports to connect your tools to the containers. So
those last two, I was pretty excited about, because yeah, especially like during development time when you're trying to set up a test or something along those lines. A lot of times you want to look and see like what did the data look like at this point and what did it look like at that point. So if I can connect, I'm just going to talk about databases here. If I can connect
Yeah.
like my database client like to the container and run some SQL queries, that's going to save me some time. So I was excited to see that.
Yes, this is very, very convenient. I like that very, very much. You sort of, this is what it looks like for people who didn't read the announcements yet. You have a sample configuration file, which would say that for all the Postgres images, you can have the local fixed port and connect into the container. Let me show you a demo. Actually, have you tried that yet?
I have not. This is cool.
Okay, so let me introduce this a very, very quick demo. This is a broken application, of course. Let me just remove the H2. I was doing something else here. Don't just look the other way for a sec. So we add the Testcontainers Postgres, and we have our container definition. So I can, let me quickly do what I would like to do. I will freeze the containers shutdown. So that will allow me to run my tests, and then the containers will not die. Ooh, what is wrong with you? Wait. Oh, sorry. Right. So I will run my test. They will run the test normally. My test will pass or fail or anything in between. And then, but because I used the test containers desktop and chose the freeze container shutdown, the stop signals to the containers will not actually succeed, but they will stop as sort of on a breakpoint. So you can see that my tests are here green, but the bigger test, the suite is still running. So that means that my container is still running. And what I can do, I can go into my database viewer, and I can connect to my Postgres instance that is running in a test container, but on a fixed local port. That is thanks to this configuration for my fixed ports with Testcontainers Desktop. So my local host 5432 will be always proxied to the Testcontainers image that is running the Postgres Docker image and into the container port, of course, right? So that means that I can connect with my tools, and then that straightforwardly goes into things, and I can explore my data, or I can run my queries either from my ID or from any local tools that I'm comfortable using for that. So, and this is just like sort of without any breakpoints, without anything. I can just, this is pretty great. I'm excited about this feature.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I hijacked this part of the conversation, but you mentioned that, and then the runtime switch, and I think this is very, very cool. That is available. This Testcontainers desktop application is obviously it is a free thing that you can download on the web page, and you can try it. If you're using Testcontainers, check it out. It is pretty cool. Right. Let's go back to the regularly scheduled program of our discussion. No, I think it's very cool. If you're watching this and you think it's cool, say something in chat. I think this is important. Right. So you said that you were using Testcontainers Cloud. You looked at running the parallel. Did you get the results? Like,
Yep. So like again, very kind of like structure dependent. So one thing that we found was that for our particular structure, running the modules in parallel was more valuable than running the tests within those individual modules in parallel. But I think like if I had to throw out a rough number, something like 30%, something along those lines, in terms of like the time that we were able to save. I think it's going to be very project structure dependent, but like roughly that kind of like idea of, if I only need to take as long as the longest executing, module, That's a
Yeah.
good one. If you're a single module, like then you probably will get more benefits from running all the tests in that module, in parallel as well.
Yeah, definitely. There are different ways to parallelize, but 30% is nothing to sneeze at. I think manually optimizing your test to be that much faster would take a lot of cycles that could be spent on actually delivering business value.
Yeah, low
Right,
hanging fruit is always nice.
right. Very, very good. I think we are getting close to being at the time, and we roughly went through most of the agenda items that I wanted to ask you about. If you're watching, if you have any questions to Austin in the chat, please do write them down. We have a few minutes for that. But personally, I would like to thank you very, very much for coming and sharing your experience with Test Containers and sharing your wisdom and sort of approach to integration tests at Fundrise. I think it was very, very cool.
Oh, great! Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. This is always fun. Gets me a little excited. So great time.
No, yeah, yes. Right. Oh, Simon says it's cool. It was great to see. Oh, I see the desktop client being donated to the community. Yeah, it's currently the Testcontainers desktop application. Try it, Austin. I'm looking forward to you trying it as well, and I would encourage everyone to please tell us all the feedback. It's currently in sort of in active development, and we would love to add more features or refine the existing features in it. So if you have any feedback about how it worked for you, how it worked for a test, for your local development, that would be very, very good. In general, any feedback we greatly appreciate. So that is that was not a question. It started like a question, so I clicked it. No, but and I'm looking forward to Austin you trying the clone and run with Spring Boot. I would love to hear your experience with that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the first class support in Spring Boot is kind of key, and I'm really excited about that. And then also the service connection capabilities. They're just making the configuration easier. I don't know how much I talked about it, but the other thing I think about is like making sure your configuration is as close to the production configuration as possible as well. If you have like fully separate configuration for the tests that you're running, like, are you really testing what your application? I would argue there's like at least an element less that you're doing. So like these things that Spring Boot has built into the ecosystem to help that like integration and really make it so you can have like one application properties file essentially, and have the same configuration running in all of your environments. That's like pretty powerful to me too. So that's exciting.
It is, and especially like for the teams with the higher diversity of the experience of individual contributors, like having your junior developers without any hassle reuse the same setup that your more experienced folks or like just more people who are longer working on this particular project can share through like programmatic config. That's a big win. So there are no more questions in the chat, so we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming. Everything that we've talked about will be in the description of the video, so check out the links and check out Fundrise. And thank you, Austin, very, very much. It was
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
It was a blast. See you next time. Thank you. Bye.